Olá, daqui Rafaela Cortês. O palestiniano Alaa Tartir tem muitos chapéus. Doutorado em desenvolvimento internacional, é consultor no think tank palestiniano de políticas públicas Al-Shabaka. Está ligado a 3 universidades europeias, entre Londres, Utrecht e Genebra. E hoje em dia vive na Suécia, onde é investigador sénior e diretor do programa para o Médio Oriente e Norte da África do Instituto Internacional de Estudos para a Paz de Estocolmo. Mas o que nos interessa, em particular, é que há mais de uma década e meia que Alaa Tartir estuda os processos de ajuda internacional à Palestina. Destrinça as razões e os mecanismos que permitiram que, desde 1993, com a assinatura dos Acordos de Oslo, tenham sido canalizados por uma pequena economia como a palestiniana mais de 50 mil milhões de dólares, o que tornou os palestinianos um dos maiores beneficiários de ajuda não militar per capita. Esta entrevista foi feita em inglês, online, em julho de 2023, durante a produção da série Indústria da Ajuda na Palestina. Como de costume, sugiro-te que ouças a série primeiro. Aqui, Alaa Tartir explica porque é que este modelo de ajuda, a que chama industrial, não criou nenhum tipo de desenvolvimento sustentável significativo. E, pelo contrário, contribuiu para a perpetuação do status quo da ocupação e colonização da Palestina. Fica com a entrevista. Since the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993, over 40 billion of international aid has flowed into Palestine, making it one of the highest per capita recipients of non-military aid in the world. Alaa, is there an aid industry in Palestine, and how does it work?
There is a big aid industry in Palestine, and the question if it works, or it works to whom. Since 1993, the Palestinians received over 50 billion, actually, not 40 billion of international aid. So that's just remarkably 10 billion more. But we're talking about serious flows in terms of aid that went to Palestine since 1993, since the signing of Oslo Accords, of $50 billion of aid, making the Palestinians one of the highest recipients of non-military aid per capita. So that's a significant amount. It's a significant amount knowing the size of the Palestinian economy, knowing the influence of the donor community, but also the nature of the governing body, which is the Palestinian Authority, and its dependency on international aid. So aid intervention is critical in the case of Palestine, is influential, and this is why I've been studying also over the past decade or more, because I was, and I'm still puzzled by the fact what's happening or what happened to these $50 billion in such a small economy, and why they did not create any kind of meaningful, sustainable development, but if anything, actually contributed to the sustainability of the status quo, which is not particularly good news to the Palestinians. So there is an aid industry, a big aid industry, so many actors involved, so many donors, so many countries, so many international and local actors that created a complex industry between the givers and the receivers, created multiple structural issues within the Palestinian society, and also created many structural deficiencies that 30 years on since this aid framework has been or has started, created many structures that are hard to reverse now.
Yes, you were saying that aid has not achieved much, and in fact, some socioeconomic indicators have actually worsened during this period. For example, the World Bank data shows that the unemployment rate went from 11% in 93 to almost 26% in 2022. The annual growth rate of real GDP, for instance, has declined since 2000. Also, the number of people living in extreme poverty has increased, and less than half of the Palestinian households were food secure in 2020. So it seems like, as you were saying, where is all this money go to, because it's definitely weird that this money being enveloped in both humanitarian purposes and also for the development of the economy, and the economy doesn't seem to be developing. So you were mentioning that it serves to kind of uphold the status quo. And what is that status quo?
Well, of course, we know roughly where the money goes to, and that is part of the problem of the design of the aid structure when this aid system is designed within the framework of colonial military occupations and structure of apartheid and continuous military occupation. But we know that with the status of dependency of the Palestinian economy on the Israeli one, or rather more of a asymmetric containment of that Palestinian economy by the Israeli one, we know that the vast majority of aid, some studies took this figure to 70%, other studies to 40% of that international aid ends directly and indirectly in the Israeli economy. We know that that international aid is going to structures and institutions of the Palestinian societies that are largely focused on the security sector, rather than more to sectors that serves directly the Palestinian people and their economic and socioeconomic needs. So the design, the allocation of these aids within the design of the Oslo aid framework is the main problem, because these allocations of aids are going to avenues that are not particularly making the Palestinians closer to achieve and realize their rights, above all, their freedom. And that's why we see a rather regression rather than development. But let's be very clear, the problem is not only the problem of aid, the problem is the context that this aid is delivered within. It is the context of the continuous occupation that is bringing the unemployment rate to an increase after the increase, and impacting all these socioeconomic indicators from poverty to inequality to employment to food security, and so on and so forth. So the issue is with the context. And when we have an aid system and aid industry that is not interested nor capable or willing to challenge these structures of powers that are a clear derivative and a clear consequence of the overall structure of Israeli occupation, then that aid becomes part of the problem. And this is what happened over the decades with all the good intentions of these international aid in most cases, yet they contribute to the existing power dynamics and solidifying these power dynamics instead of challenging that, instead of confronting that. And for that aid to be more effective, it needs to challenge the existing power dynamics of basically colonial domination of Israel over Palestine and over the Palestinians. If this international aid does not challenge the existing power structures in Palestine, Israel, then it becomes part of the problem. And this is what we're seeing now, and these are the consequences that we're witnessing over the years. But when we talk about the impact of aid in this case, I mean, here I'm providing a particular or take on it, providing this critical take on it. But it doesn't mean that this aid industry has been failing for all actors. This is why it's been going for all these decades. There are fundamental believers in this aid structure, in the Oslo economic framework, in the aid modality of Oslo Accords as it was designed by the World Bank at the time, and it was called Investment in Peace. So there are different categorizations of different actors that perceive aid and aid intervention differently, and this is also a reflection of to the extent that this aid intervention became a large industry where you see different actors interacting differently with the aid, perceiving aid differently, and some of them perceive this aid as a success story. They perceive this aid as a success story because it was able and successful in disciplining, silencing the Palestinians, maintaining control over the Palestinians and their resistance. And it supported the status quo that operates in favor of Israel and other Western interests. So this branch out there think the aid structures are working, and this is why they continue to invest in that one.
And by that, do you mean the European Union, the World Bank, Israel? Are those the actors to which this framework is being a huge success?
Well, if we want to break down the different actors and how they perceive aid, we can think of four different frameworks or four different perceptions or perspectives rather in relation to the aid industry in Palestine. There's one branch or perspective that we call aid instrumentalists. So those aid instrumentalists, particularly like the World Bank, for example, who designed this Oslo aid model, they believe that the Oslo model was and remains inherently sound, but that it was the externality of political events beyond their control that got in the way out of it succeeding. So that's one way how for example, the World Bank perceive this. But there are others that we can see as aid realists, what we call them neocolonialists, like some think tank in DC, for example. Again, they understand aid in its functionality as a tool to silence Palestinians and their resistance to keep the status quo that in operations of Israel and other Western interests. But with the EU in particular here, we put largely the EU in another category, or another perspective that we call critical instrumentalists. These critical instrumentalists, like the EU, they share the instrumentalist faith in the Oslo aid model, but they focus on the politics of the Israeli military occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories. They focus on violations of Palestinian human rights, Israeli settlement buildings, and they see that it is the problem, that it is the continuation of the Israeli occupation is the barrier for development to take place. But they don't go the extra mile and challenge the root causes of the issue here, of the Israeli occupation. So this is where I would categorize the EU. The other final voice is the critics, who they see that, as I was describing earlier, that the aid model is part of the problem. It is definitely not part of a liberation process, or aid delivery is not a liberating process, but rather another tool for domination that needs to be resisted, that needs to be corrected, that needs to be reinvented in order to deliver better and more effective aid.
Okay, I actually wanted to maybe talk a little bit more about that part in the end, because I'm very interested to know about any kind of other alternatives that are proposed or that you believe in personally. But I wanted to touch on something you said about being part of the problem, the whole framework, I mean, and also about like the integration with Israel, because in 1994 the Paris Protocol was introduced as an annex to the Oslo Accords that integrated the Palestinian and Israeli economies, under which all foreign aid to Palestine has to pass through Israel, which is free to tax it. And an Israeli negotiator involved in designing the protocol said it basically legalized the forced marriage of the two economies since 1967. As for the PA, this protocol was intended to expire after 5 years, but it's still in effect 30 years later. So was Palestinian dependency on the Israeli economy intentionally designed into the Oslo Accords?
Of course, Palestinian independency was designed as part of Oslo Accords. If we think now we have the luxury to look at the Oslo Accords and reflect on it, anything that resembles anything related or close to independence or autonomy or sovereignty was really not on the table from Israeli perspective here, from the designer of Oslo Accords, because that would change the power dynamics. That would empower the Palestinians. That could bring the Palestinians closer to their self-determination and freedom. And the economy was part of that. There was no interest, no intention of the designers of the Oslo Accords, despite the rhetoric there, to build a sovereign, independent Palestinian economy. It was by design contained by the Israeli one, under this neoliberal rationale that there will be a trickle-down effect, in the sense that the Israeli economy is a stronger economy, is a larger economy. Because of that, then it will have some positive trickle-down effect that will lift the Palestinian economy, that will bring some dividends to the Palestinian people. This is what they called at the time peace dividends. But this rationale proved over and over again that it's flawed. It's fundamentally flawed because here we're not talking about any intention of empowering the Palestinian economy to be a viable economy that is able to help the Palestinians in their journey to freedom and to self-determination. It is by design to keep the Palestinian economy dependent on the Israeli one and contained by the Israeli one, and dependent on the international donor funds, because this is the structure, this is the design where we see the problem. And of course, the counter argument would say that this was supposed to be only for 5 years, and then the Palestinians would take agency and move on and build their independent economy. But I think the realities on the grounds and the facts speaks louder. These 5 years, they were supposed to be in 1999, and now we're 2023. And if anything, the Palestinian economy is even more entrenched in its dependency on the Israeli one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And as you were saying, so the PA was created as part of the Oslo, and it was supposed to stop transitioning into some form of government in 1999, but it continues until today, even though there haven't been elections since 2006. And it is very reliant, as you were saying, on import taxes collected by Israel on the PA's behalf, and also donor aid. So where does PA fit in this aid framework?
Well, the PA fits in the aid framework as the key recipient of that aid, as the key relatively passive recipient of that aid, definitely not in the driver's seat when it comes to the design of development plans. Again, despite the different rhetoric and the different announcements and the different plans, but the Palestinian Authority became part of the problem in the way it deals with the international aid going to the Palestinians, the way it allocates it, the way that its security establishment receives most of it, and the salaries for its public servants. But also it became a key source for its mere existence, that which is international aid, plus the tax modality as dictated by the Paris Protocol between Israel and the Palestinians. And that's where the Palestinian Authority as well contributes to the sustainability of the status quo by refusing again to challenge these structures in place. And whenever it tries to challenge those structures in place, it realizes the structural element to the extent that this structural element is solid, that the Palestinian Authority is unable to fundamentally challenge these structures of power, and therefore puts it in a very hard position also to negotiate from a position of strength. So that whole idea of dependency on aid, but also on the Paris Protocol to transfer the taxes to the Palestinian Authority, put the Palestinian Authority in a very bad, weak negotiation position that can easily be blackmailed whenever it resists the overall control structures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels a bit weird that all these international donors, such as the European Union and all these others, the US, the individual countries in Europe, the World Bank, all of these that preach the values of democracy so much are also very okay in funding a sort of, it's not really a government, but a sort of government that hasn't been elected since 2006. So why do you think there's this double standard when it comes to the PA?
Because the international community and the donor community, they are mainly interested in stability, in sustaining the status quo. And they know that their intervention in the way that it's been conducted over the past decades will never, ever lead to a meaningful, lasting peace. All what their intervention is designed for is designed to secure Israel, to provide security for Israel, or what we call Israel first, Israel security first approach, where the primary goal of that intervention is really to secure Israel, to secure the status quo, to ensure stability, and not to empower the Palestinians to gain their freedom. What happened over the past year, particularly with Ukraine and in Ukraine, was very clear testimony how the international donor community, in particular European ones, do this practice double standards and contradict their values. As out of the sudden we discovered that European Union and European institutions have the power and political will to do certain things that weren't still impossible to do in the case of Palestine. But back to the main point of double standards, the Palestinian Authority, after all, is the creation of the international community, and therefore the international community is committed to the sustainability of this body that they've created, the Palestinian Authority, whatever it takes, and whatever human rights record is there, and whatever, if it is authoritarian or not authoritarian, that is irrelevant in the eyes of international policymakers, including the European ones. What matters to them at the end of the day is that they're a Palestinian governing body, a Palestinian bureaucracy that creates this misleading feeling that a Palestinian state in the making, and it is again part of this aid industry, part of the external intervention industry, because otherwise what would the international community do? Then the international community has to deal directly with Israel and its occupying forces and its control of and its regime of colonial control and apartheid structure directly. But in this case,
or deal with Hamas.
Well, in case of,
for example, in case the PA falls, if they have elections and Hamas wins, as they have before, then the international community will have to deal with that, and that is not a very appealing scenario for the international community.
Well, this is what happened back in 2006 when Hamas won the election in the largely democratic elections, and the international community decided to boycott the elected government at the time, regardless if we agree with it or not. But this is what the Palestinian people elected. And I do hope that whenever Palestinian elections, a democratic one, takes place, I do hope that the international community, and particularly the European ones, learn the lessons and learn the hard lessons. Because I argue if at the time the European community engaged with the elected bodies, we will be facing different realities now. We will be in a different political spot than where we are now, and I think and I hope that the international community will respect the Palestinian democracy whenever it happens, especially that it is quite rare to happen. So when it happens, the international community is advised to accept the results, as the Palestinians accept the results of whatever European actors bring to governments, from racist to right-wing governments to so on. And the Palestinians has to deal with that. So this idea of pick and choose and we only do business with the partners that we deal with. We're talking about different momentum, and I hope the Europeans in particular has learned the lessons the hard way.
Mm-hmm. As you were mentioning, the PA is the largest employer in the West Bank. In 2022, an estimated 150,000 people are on the PA's payroll. Is the PA too big to fail at this point?
Well, the PA is very entrenched to fail at the moment. We're talking about an entrenched body in the Palestinian society that's been expanding over the past 30 years. We're talking about 150,000 to 160,000 of public servants, but that means a direct dependency of almost 1 million Palestinians on these salaries. We're talking about an economic elite that is directly linked with the existence of the Palestinian Authority and its leadership and the current structure. So it's not only the Palestinian Authority on stake here, but also the private sector that it created over the years that is also dependent on the Palestinian Authority, and they will be fierce fighters to stop the Palestinian Authority from collapsing. And here I'm referring to banks, to economic entities, to companies that have direct links and synchronized with the existence of the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority is deeply entrenched. It doesn't mean that it's not fragile, it's not at the edge of collapse, it's not that all of that is there, but the actors who are interested in keeping the Palestinian Authority afloat, being the international community, the Palestinian private sector, and Israel as well, are definitely, they will be doing all their best to keep the Palestinian Authority afloat, even if not functional, even if it doesn't deliver service, even if it does not represent the Palestinians. All these are on the side. The main thing is that the Palestinian Authority as a buffer, even as a nominal governing body is there, that's in the interest of all these actors. What we could see different functionality of the PA if there is a serious project in Palestinian politics. We see different tasks of the PA that reflect the realities of the finances of the PA, for example. But the PA is there. There are so many beneficiaries from its existence, including obviously Palestinians, Palestinian people, Palestinian economic class, that would make it hard just to collapse tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to go back a bit to still 1993, there's a lot of stuff happened that year. The ad hoc liaison committee was also created, a high-level group of 15 key political actors, including the World Bank, the FMI, the United Nations, the USA, the EU, Israel, and also the Palestinian Authority, to set the policy framework and development priorities for donor aid to Palestine. In the mid-1990s, Rick Hooper, which was he was a chief of staff of the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. He said that over time, it would become evident in practice that Israel would have considerable influence on the allocation of funds, since donors would be reluctant to finance projects to which Israel strongly objected or could be expected to object. So why are so many countries and organizations involved in setting the agenda and priorities for the Palestinian people? And why does the occupying power have a seat at the table?
So many actors are involved in this because the Middle East peace process matters to them, because they cannot ignore that big elephant in the room. They cannot ignore that peace process party and not attend it and not be part of it and not have a seat around the table. It doesn't mean that all these actors are really interested in bringing peace to the Middle East. So this is why we have so many actors involved in this Middle East peace process or peacemaking in the Middle East. So this is why we see so many of them engaged. And the Ad hoc Liaison Committee is one of the structural elements of that aid modality. But even that is becoming so predictable, so boring, in the sense that we all know that every year they will meet twice. All observers know what kind of reports will be submitted. All observers know what kind of statements will be delivered, and so on and so forth. It became so predictable, so much of a routine and a ritual rather than anything really meaningful. And this is another illustration of the problem of these aid modalities, that all these, or this particular aid committee, if the actors who are sitting around the table there are honest with themselves, they can just look in the mirror and say, what are we doing here? Haven't we read these same statements years ago? Maybe not ourselves, but also our colleagues. But every meeting of these meetings offer a moment of reflections for these actors around the table. Still, they refuse to engage with that moment of reflection and the moment of honesty just for themselves, just so they can really be true and genuine to themselves, instead of just being part of this industry and say, what is happening? Why are we discussing here same issues, same challenges? We know the answers already. We know what are the issues. We're trying to avoid that and just come up with this technocratic language that all these international institutions can write and reflect in this fancy way. It is really, after 30 years, it is important to have this time and reflect on all these failures in a moment of truth. The questions if they are interested. The matter of fact that such a committee has a seat for the occupying power is another telling story. And not only if it is an occupying power, if you go to the OECD database, you see Israel as one of the donors to the Palestinians and to the Palestinian Authority, which is really mind-blowing. And allowing the space for Israel and the podium to go to these meetings in New York and in Brussels and elsewhere to show all the humanitarian responses and humanitarian help that is given to the Palestinians is just extremely surreal and extremely. I really don't have the word, but if you have Israel on that table, it should be only for one purpose: to hold it accountable. If you bring Israel to engage with it, and you know that Israel violates international law on a daily, as a daily practice, and you give Israel the podium to normalize it and normalize its operations and normalize its settler colonial project and normalize its apartheid structures, then the international community continued to be complicit in sustaining all of that. Instead of that, Israel should be brought to the table and should have a seat, but to be held accountable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. The way you were describing the procedures is almost as if they were putting out a theater play, like a show, a performance, year after year after year, just the same performance over and over again. And so,
but it is a very bad performance because it's a very bad performance because people pay their lives for that performance. Because the sustainability of the status quo, it means that people lose their life for these actors to engage in that very bad performance. And this is exactly why I was referring to the moment of enough, the moment of reflection, the moment of truth, that these actors needs to be engaged with it. And if you engage with many of these actors in private conversation, in off-the-records conversation, you know that they know it. They know what is the issue. They know what are the root causes. The question is when they will bring these honest conversations to the podium, to these tables, instead of just using all these flowery statements or whatever we call them, just to show the commitment after commitment to nothing.
Yeah, and this whole framework is based on the premise of a peace process. Would you say the peace process is dead?
Well, the process is there. I never call it a peace process because there was never an intention to create peace. I always say it is really a problem to start talking about peace now, because what we need to talk about prerequisites for peace, because there is no real peace or any kind of meaningful peace that goes in hand with continuation of colonialism and apartheid and violation of international law on a daily basis. What is needed is a context, is an environment, a conducive environment that starts tackling prerequisites for peace, how we can get closer to peace. And that's what is needed. What we've been seeing over the decades is an engagement with the process. And the emphasis here is really on the process, regardless to what it results in. There is, as we said, there is an aid industry, and that's, on the other hand, there is a peace industry. And again, this is why we keep talking about it, we keep sustaining it, and this is why many international actors keep engaging with it, so mainly to feel better about themselves.
Yeah, and moving a bit to where the money that comes from international aid goes to, I wanted to touch on something you mentioned already, which is the security sector that receives around 30% of international aid, and it accounts, I think, from approximately 1/3 of the PA's budget. There are currently over 80,000 people working in the security forces in the Palestinian territories, with 65,000 receiving salaries from the PA. It's also one of the highest ratios of security personnel to civilians in the world. Why are international donors pouring so much money in this sector? Is it the what you were talking about before about this is a project to ensure that Israel's security and not Palestinian security?
I think it's very simple. It's because the Oslo Accords is, in a sense, a security arrangement. Not more than that. This is why I always refer to it as Oslo Accords and never as Oslo Peace Accords. It is more of a security arrangement between the occupied and the occupier. It's a securitized agreement. Peace is never in the middle of or in the center of these arrangements. It is security that is always in the center. And it is not the security of the Palestinians. It is the security of the Israelis, and the security of Israel is in the core and the center of this. It is therefore, it is not surprising that a major portion of that aid money and major percentage of the Palestinian Authority budget goes to the security forces and its many security bodies out there. Not to protect the Palestinians. As we speak now, Jenin refugee camp is under a massive incursion, massive attack. Where all these were, how many? 65,000 security personnel that we're talking about, and they are supposed to be the Palestinian security forces and security establishments. So this is why we don't see them anywhere. This is why it is a reflection of the status of dependency. It is a reflection of the securitized arrangement and what I call securitization of everything, in the sense that anything that has security twist to it would attract the attention of the donor, but not when it comes to securing the Palestinians. It is securing Israel, securing the existing arrangement, securing the status quo, securing stability, and so on and so forth. This is where the money goes to. And by extension, it goes to the security forces of the Palestinian Authority because it ensures the securitization of all these processes. It ensures that it is another mechanisms of control. And this is why we see within this highly securitized context of security arrangement of Oslo, this is where the main money, the main funds go to. Just imagine if over all these years, these resources were allocated to create a productive economy, or to address inequality gaps, or to address the root causes of poverty, or to enhance the Palestinian economy to be more self-reliant, or to address the root causes of food insecurity, and so on and so forth. Then we're talking about dealing with developmental challenges rather than just securing a highly securitized structure that is not interested in enhancing the capacities of the Palestinian people and investing in their transformative capacities that gets them closer to freedom and self-determination. So this is why we see all these funds going to security establishments and not to other sectors that the Palestinians really need and would really empower them to get closer to freedom.
Yeah, exactly. Even though there are plenty of reports about its human rights violations and misuse of power and everything else, even though we know about that, we still keep pouring money into the security forces. And I was just going to say, especially exactly what you were mentioning, because on the other side of the spectrum, areas such as agriculture or industry are critically underfunded. For example, since the PA's establishment and the implementation of international aid programs, the amount allocated to the agriculture sector did not exceed 1% of the total PA budget. So, yeah, I was going to ask, if the goal is to build a strong economy, why aren't these productive sectors a priority?
Well, it is not a coincidence that sectors like the agriculture sector is not receiving funds, neither from international aid nor from the Palestinians. It is by design. It is by design that these productive sectors are not receiving the resources they need and they require, because that will empower the Palestinians. That will strengthen the Palestinian positions in their land. That will strengthen the negotiation power of the Palestinians. That will help the Palestinians to realize some of their transformative capacities and to achieve more developmental gains. This is why any investment in sectors, in areas that changes the power dynamics in the favor of the Palestinians are not areas that are particularly considered by the international aid money or even the Palestinian Authority money. Look how much of or how little of aid or budget goes to Palestinians in Area C, or to agriculture sector, or to productive economy, or to any projects or schemes that allows the Palestinians to claim agency even in the economic domain. So all of that is part of the design. All of that is part of the design of dominance and control, and this is why we don't see the investment in that. And this is where part of the solution starts, by realizing that this is an issue and this is a problem, and then go to these difficult spots, if you like. These are the areas, for example, one of them is agriculture, where the international community, the Palestinian Authority, will be forced to confront Israel, to confront the power dynamics, to confront the imbalances of power. So this is really going to these difficult spots requires engaging in processes of confrontation with the status quo that's been going on and on for 30 years now. So this is why it will not be an easy task. But above all, it's a political decision, it's a political will, and it's a commitment. It's a commitment to get the Palestinians closer to their freedom by going to other areas that matters to the Palestinians, that matters to justice, and that matters to peace.
Yeah, when we reached out to the World Bank for an interview, they refused, and they wrote a statement saying that the World Bank regards donor support as vital to support the persistent fiscal deficit and help develop a sound economic and social political base. And that's not true then. They're not interested in creating, developing a sound economic and social political base.
Well, the World Bank masters the rhetoric and the language of development, but in reality, they are part of the problem, as I mentioned earlier. And they think that they are a political institution. They think that they are technocratic institutions. They care about these technical interventions through these bureaucratic language. But the irony is that their intervention, the design of the Oslo Accords, has very clear political implications, very clear political consequences, and taking pretending to be apolitical, pretending to be an institution that does not impact the power dynamics on the ground is very misleading and very inaccurate. And by now they managed to hide behind this kind of language that you just narrated. And that's where this language needs to be debunked, needs to be challenged, and needs to be exposed. And it is really not acceptable anymore to use such a language and to use this rhetoric to explain what is happening in terms of developmental failures and in terms of consequences of the continuation of the occupation and the failure of aid. Again, it is really critical that institutions like the World Bank, which is a critical and important institution in the design of this aid framework, to be challenged, but also to start again reflecting objectively on the consequences of their intervention.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that donor priorities have shifted over these 3 decades?
Well, Yeah, I mean, donors' priorities have shifted over. They have shifted over the years and over the decades, depending on the fashion in aid industry globally. And back in the capitals, it moved from democratic transitions to state building to securitization to multiple thematic focuses, if you want. So yes, it shifted because it shifted also with the realities on the ground. At the beginning, in the early 90s, the whole focus was on solidifying the peace accords, the Oslo Accords, solidifying this, what they call peace accords, but solidifying the structure that created then and building in the institutions of the Palestinian Authority, regardless of all issues of corruption and all of that. The idea was just to invest in that. Then after that, with the second intifada, the aid priorities shifted to meet humanitarian needs. And after that, aid priorities shifted to focus on building the security sector of the Palestinian Authority. So most money went to security sector reform after the second intifada. And then later on, the whole focus became on building the Palestinian state to the extent that in 2011 or so, the World Bank and other international institutions said the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian state exists in all but name. And this was also what the prime minister at the time said. And then later on, it became on how to provide economic benefits and move to this economic peace approach, and just to bring all these monies to sustain the business as usual. So yes, aid amounts, priorities shifted over the years and over the decades, but the overall big headline is still the same. That is still the constant in the process, and this is where aid continue to miss the root causes of the issue.
Mm-hmm. And does aid money that flow into Palestine come with strings attached?
Well, not only to Palestine, aid money goes to anywhere comes with string attached, being implicit or being explicit, being direct or being indirect. So conditionality is part of the package of aid. We always say whenever aid comes in, it comes with a set of conditionalities, be it political, economic, or other conditionalities. And in the case of Palestine, there are multiple implicit and explicit conditionalities attached with the aid packages related to where to spend the money, how to spend it, on what, with whom to work, with whom not to work, who to label with what, and who aid can serve and who cannot serve. And over the past couple of years, we saw this criminalization of multiple Palestinian civil society as one example. So, of course, it goes by default that aid comes with different sets of conditionality, largely, obviously, political in the case of Palestine, but I don't think this is breaking news per se. What is important is how to deal with these conditionalities, how to approach them, how to be ready for these conditionalities, and to work with them and challenge them and confront them. So it is really the active process from the recipient side, in this case, how these conditionalities attached to aid can be dealt with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one that keeps being mentioned in everyone that we've spoken to is the terrorism clause, which is very specific to Palestine. and there's several others. How have you seen these conditions impact either local NGOs or organizations on the ground?
Well, a lot of these terrorism clauses were directly linked to the engagement of the Palestinian civil society and the NGOs, and the listing of a number of Palestinian civil society organizations and NGOs on different kinds of terrorism-related lists in Western capitals. But this was a clear illustration of the conditionalities attached with aid. It was a clear testimony of the surrender of the international community and international donor community to Israel conditionality. And it was a clear illustration of how little the international community is interested in confronting these conditions on the ground, and conditions by Israel, and conditions of and confronting the powers imbalances that we talked about. So that's again a direct consequence of aid conditionality and aid reliance that allows the donor community to go very far in categorizing the Palestinians and in putting them in different categories. We work with this category, we don't work with that category, and so on and so forth. But this was, again, another consequence of how the Palestinian agency being weakened over the decades to allow such thing to happen.
Mm-hmm. And how explicit are these conditions?
They can be very explicit, as in the terrorism clause, or clauses that you need to do this and you cannot do that and you can't do that. They can be contractual, they can be there and they can be binding, but also they can be implicit by different kinds of practices, by different kinds of limits, by different kind of self-censorship on the donor sides and also on the Palestinian civil society side. So they can be explicit and they can be implicit, and that depends on the donor we're talking about, but also the recipient that we're talking about. Just looking at the UNRWA in this case, and what is happening with all its funding and all the conditionalities attached to delivery of service, of curricula, who to work with, who's not to working with, and that's just one example. But unfortunately, there are multiple examples that illustrate the explicit nature and the implicit natures of these conditionalities when it comes to aid.
And what are the consequences of these politically conditional funding?
Well, one of the main consequences is that the Palestinian needs are not met. The Palestinian people needs are dismissed. The Palestinian people's aspirations are neglected. And that's when we see this mismatch or contrast between what the Palestinian peoples want the money to do for them and where they are really spent. And that's a major consequence of where all these billions of dollars don't mean much to the Palestinians on a daily basis, because they don't see the effect of these funds. So it is really this gap between the needs and the aspirations and where the money gets spent in real terms.
Yeah, because are Palestinian people being listened to in terms of what is important for them, or are just in international communities deciding for them where the money needs to be funded, which projects need to be funded, and under which conditions?
Well, that's a bit complex, because the Palestinian people are not listened to even in their own political systems and in their own political structures. They are neglected and marginalized within their political system. So, and then that results in a question or a crisis of legitimacy across the board, the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority, but also the legitimacy of Palestinian civil society as well, especially with the NGOization process that's been ongoing for many years now. So there is a legitimacy gap. There is a trust issue, and therefore, to what extent the Palestinian people in the streets are heard and their aspirations are reflected in the aid business or even in the plans of the Palestinian Authority is an issue. I don't think there are mechanisms in place to ensure that the voices of the people are heard or reflected in there. Despite, of course, we hear all about all this rhetoric that this is people-centric driven and civil society consultations and all of that. But there are no mechanisms in place that ensures that the Palestinian people's voices are reflected in these aspirations and demands. And if you look at multiple surveys, public surveys and opinion polls, you can get a glimpse of what they like, what they want to see, what are their aspirations, what are their needs, and just do the simple exercise to see how much of that is matched in reality, not only from the aid funds, but beyond that. And we see the trust gap and the legitimacy gaps and the needs gap is wide across.
Mm-hmm. And we heard a lot, for example, that these conditions were, for example, normalizing the occupation because they were forcing a lot of projects that had joined Palestinian-Israeli teams. We've also heard that these conditions undermined the Palestinian resistance. Do you agree with that?
Well, these two examples related to people or joint Palestinian-Israeli teams and criminalization of resistance. These are illustrations of these conditionalities on aid. And you see this pillar of people-to-people or normalization or joint projects as being very explicit in multiple donors' interventions and very implicit in many others. But of course, that goes to what we discussed earlier about the peace industry, about the engagement in the so-called peace process, because that would be a key pillar for the donors in this case to ensure that this is happening. This is how they can justify the money. This is a way that they think they could contribute to larger peace. So this is why we see this kind of conditionality on normalization, on people to people, on joint projects, and of course many of these economic activities, for example, in the IT domain and in other domains, you see joint businesses that receives investments and startups capital and aid to continue, and that is part of the conditionality. And so goes about for the criminalization of resistance. Any aid that contribute to empowering the Palestinians to resist in any way and in the broader sense is not. You will not see the donor community interested in sponsoring that in any way or mean. That they will endorse these conditionalities and enforce them to make sure that the money and these mechanisms are vetted and will not go into these domains.
Mm-hmm. We've been kind of hinting towards this, but we didn't actually talk about it. But international NGOs are, for example, international NGOs, but also a lot of the international community is based on this idea, these principles of impartiality and neutrality. For example, the International Committee of the Red Cross extensively discusses how those principles contribute to humanitarian effectiveness by gaining acceptance and access to affected communities that otherwise would be unreachable. What does neutrality mean in the context of Palestine?
Well, there is no such thing as neutrality anywhere, anyway. And this is more evident in the case of Palestine. What do we mean by neutrality? There is a status of colonial occupations, apartheid, military occupation, and then talking about neutrality is really difficult to grasp, put it mildly. Here I'm talking more about whatever consequence, whatever decision is taken in that context will have consequences. It is different when it comes to humanitarian interventions, because then that's really to address immediate humanitarian needs and humanitarian gaps. And that's a different story. I'm talking here about developmental aid. I'm talking here about aid that build these institutions that get the Palestinians closer to their freedom. And that's different than aid interventions in the humanitarian domain or reconstruction processes. That is more of a commitment. That is more of a commitment and duty to do that. It comes up with its different challenges and problems, but it is really puzzling to talk about neutrality in anywhere really, let alone be in Palestine. If we want to talk about anything, let's talk about how objective intervention could result in meaningful consequences.
Yeah, and you said that, yeah, of course, in the humanitarian lens, it's one thing to look at neutrality, but the fact is that a lot of times we look at Palestine as a humanitarian problem, not a political one.
Yes, but that was the problem of how Palestine became categorized to strip it from from the political essence of the issue. The Palestinian issue became equivalent to a permanent humanitarian crisis, and all of that is just to take away the political dimension of the main problem, and that's where when Palestine is perceived as a permanent humanitarian crisis, that just keeps avoiding the political roots of the problems, including these humanitarian problems that are out there. They are not just. It's not an earthquake happened and then there is a need to address these humanitarian needs. There is a political construct of these humanitarian issues.
Yeah, exactly. And even more than a humanitarian problem, we sometimes look at it as a post-conflict problem and employ the same approaches that are used in actual post-conflict countries.
Although the occupation is so visible, but still many actors try to pretend that it doesn't exist, and we're talking about post-war, post-conflict situation, which is really problematic if people sitting there from the international community are not able to see the occupation just in front of their eyes and then to start about post-conflict frameworks. That is really an illustration of how wrong this whole industry became.
Yeah, and so just moving on to the last question, I wanted to ask you, what are the alternatives to this aid framework? Like, should we just scrap it all together and build something new? And do you believe international aid has a role in Palestine today?
Well, when we talk about alternatives to existing aid framework, I think engaging in a process to expose the current problems with the current framework is part of the process of building an alternative. And that's really important because it shows us the fundamental problems of the existing aid modality, and challenging that, reversing these steps is a process in itself and requires so much effort and time. And we're talking here about 30 years of intervention that we can build different counter alternatives or counter steps to address these issues that the aid industry have created. There are so many alternatives there that we know about it and we don't know about it, in the sense that are community-led, for example, alternatives that empower local communities. And then the question would be how to have this trickle-up effect to have a larger scope. There are really many initiatives from different sectors, from the agriculture sector to the cultural sector, to the economic sector, that aims mainly to empower the Palestinians as a way to change the power imbalances that is there. But what is needed for that alternative framework to be built is also to have a leadership for that framework with a different vision, with a different articulation that puts this alternative aid model or alternative economic model in order to start building something new. It has to be locally built. It has to be from the bottom up, in the absence of a leadership from the top that is able and interested in doing that. And the international community can contribute to that process and is part of that process, because I'm not saying that, okay, let's scrap this all out and let's start new, because it doesn't work like that. The international community first needs to acknowledge all the different harms that they've been causing over the years, and engage in a process on how to bring corrective measures to that, how to bring more accountability, and how to listen to the Palestinians, how to go beyond this rhetoric of ownership into real operationalization of localization and ownership, and not to look and adopt these top-down approaches, but rather to listen and to rethink their approaches and rethink their interventions, building on 30 years of intervention that did not bring the Palestinians closer to achieve their rights. So it wouldn't make lots of sense to think the international community will just disappear and will not engage with all of this, and then the Palestinians has to deal with it. Doesn't work like that. But once we have more transparency, more accountability mechanisms, and once the Palestinians are in the driver's seats, they own this process and they ensure dignity in these processes of delivery, then we're talking about different process that would change the power dynamics. And changing the power dynamics through confrontation is the first step in creating an alternative paradigm.
Acabaste de ouvir uma entrevista com o investigador palestiniano Alaa Tartir, gravada em 2023 durante a produção da Indústria da Ajuda na Palestina. Podes ouvir essa série de 4 episódios em qualquer aplicação de podcasts. Esta entrevista foi feita por mim, Rafaela Cortês. A Margarida David Cardoso cortou-a e escreveu isto que te estou a ler. O Bernardo Afonso editou o som. Joana Teresa Batista fez a identidade gráfica. O Lucas Grimou de Freitas, a estratégia de comunicação. Fred Rocha tratou do website. Consultem fumaca.pt a série completa, várias outras entrevistas, visualizações de dados e uma enorme lista de livros, filmes e podcasts que nos foram úteis nesta investigação. Fazem ainda parte da equipa Fumaça António Assunção, Luís Marquês, Maria Almeida, Nuno Viegas e Ricardo Esteves Ribeiro. Até já!